Welcome to the Laboratory of Social Anatomy. If you believe that money is merely an equivalent of the value of goods and services, you have already lost. Money is not paper, and it is not digits on a screen. It is an instrument of dominance, a biological marker of status, and a subtle mechanism for managing the will of others. The majority of you live in an illusion of security, believing that honest labor and following the rules will provide you with stability. This is a fatal error. In the food chain of social predators, you are merely fuel if you do not understand exactly how your neurons react to the scent of power and the brilliance of another person's capital. We will not speak of quote 0 or quote 1. We dissect the mechanisms that force you to obey, to surrender resources, and to feel insignificant. Today, we begin the dismantling of your protective mechanisms. Prepare to see reality without the filters of morality. Chapter 1. The Effect of Illusory Security. 1. Phase quote 2. Julian sat in a dark leather chair. His posture was relaxed, yet every movement radiated the dangerous precision of a predator who already knows the outcome of the hunt. Opposite him sat Marcus, an ambitious entrepreneur whose startup had just encountered its first difficulties. Marcus convulsively gripped a glass of water, his fingers trembling slightly, beating a barely audible rhythm against the glass. Quote 3, Julian said, maintaining a pause of 7 seconds. He deliberately stretched the silence, observing how his interlocutor began to fill it with unnecessary fuss. Julian slowly leaned forward. His pupils were slightly dilated, a sign of focus on the target. Marcus swallowed. He felt his throat go dry. Quote 5, Marcus exhaled. He was already visualizing this money in his account, not noticing how his brain had begun to produce dopamine, blinding the rational part of his consciousness. Julian corrected calmly. He saw how Marcus's eyes widened and knew that at that moment, the victim's critical thinking had finally shut down. A large jackpot paralyzes the will. Julian did not look at the documents. He looked at Marcus's right hand, which involuntarily reached for the collar of his shirt. This was a gesture of self-cleansing, a classic reaction to hidden stress and a subconscious sensation of a trap. Julian took a sip of ice water, not taking his eyes off Marcus. Quote 8. Marcus froze. The silence in the office became palpable, heavy like a cold fog. Julian continued to remain silent, using the pause as an instrument of torture. 2. Phase quote 9 Here we see classic cognitive suppression through the inflation of expectations. By offering an amount twice as large as requested, Julian triggered a powerful dopamine release in Marcus. In this state, the brain ignores long-term risks, focusing instead on immediate reward. The mechanism applied here is the quote 10. Julian is not simply buying a stake in the company. He is buying Marcus's will. The use of silence is a method of informational vacuum. Marcus, feeling discomfort from the silence, subconsciously strives to interrupt it, becoming more pliable and inclined toward compromise. Physiologically, Marcus is in a state of a mild cortisol attack. His quote 11 response indicates that he perceives Julian as a dominant individual. His brain has already lost the battle for hierarchy. 3. Phase quote 12. This case resembles the famous quote 13 experiment, often used in neuroeconomics. In this experiment, one player is given a sum of money and must offer a portion to another. If the second player refuses, neither receives anything. Rationally, the second player should accept any amount, even $1, as it is more than zero. However, psychologists discovered that people often reject unfair offers, less than 25% of the total sum, because their brain activates the insular cortex, which is responsible for the feeling of disgust. Julian, being a strategist, bypassed this mechanism. He offered so much, 10 million, that the feeling of disgust from losing control was suppressed by greed. He utilized a biological vulnerability. When the stakes are too high, the brain perceives the loss of freedom as an acceptable price for survival in a _14 environment. 4. Phase. _15. Marcus should have understood. When the price seems too favorable, the real product is you yourself. To seize the initiative, Marcus should have broken Julian's script. Lesson number 1. Radical pragmatism. Never accept an offer at the moment of an emotional peak. If you are offered twice as much as you asked for, it means they intend to buy you entirely, including your right to tomorrow. Take a deep breath. Lower the dopamine level through a conscious delay of the response for 24 hours. He who is prepared to wait always holds the advantage. 5. Phase. __16 _16 The air in the office smelled of expensive perfume with notes of sandalwood and the barely perceptible ozone scent of the working air conditioner. This cold was artificial, as was Julian's smile. Outside the window, the lights of the night city seemed like a scattering of precious stones. But for Julian, this was merely a map of the territory he was consistently subordinating to his will. Every sound, the creak of the leather chair, the clink of ice in the glass, was part of his symphony of control. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Gratitude. If you think that money destroys relationships only at the moment of its absence, you are deeply mistaken. Real destruction begins when one partner turns capital into an instrument of a silent contract. In everyday life, this is called "17" or "18." But in our laboratory, we call it the creation of a debt noose. Empathy is a luxury you cannot afford if you wish to preserve the sovereignty of your personality. He who pays for your comfort will sooner or later claim rights over your will. Today, we will analyze how "19" gestures turn into shackles. 1. Phase "20". Eleonora slowly stirred her tea, watching Marcus study the statement of his account. In the living room, an ideal, almost sterile cleanliness prevailed. The silence was interrupted only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, which counted the seconds of his humiliation. A month ago, Marcus found himself in a difficult situation due to a failed project, and Eleonora, asking no questions, transferred a sum with 5 zeros to his account. Without receipts, without conditions, __21 Eleonora said, barely lifting the corner of her lips. She saw how the muscles of his jaw tightened. This was a reaction of suppressed anger and shame. __22 Marcus looked up. In his eyes was gratitude mixed with a sticky feeling of dependence. __23 __24 she answered softly, adjusting an invisible fold on his sleeve. This gesture was an act of marking territory. She was physically reducing his personal space, demonstrating her right to proximity, bought for $100,000. __25 Marcus hated these evenings. He had planned to spend the weekend working to restore his affairs. __26 He made a weak attempt at resistance. Eleonora placed her cup on the saucer. The sound of porcelain against porcelain rang out like a shot in that silence. She did not answer immediately, maintaining a pause of 9 seconds. Quote 27 __. Her voice became a tone colder. Quote 28 __. Marcus felt a coldness spread through his chest. It was not fear, but the realization that his time and his plans no longer belonged to him. He nodded. 1 short, jerky nod. 2. Phase __. Quote 29 __. In this scenario, Eleonora uses the rule of reciprocal exchange as a weapon. Psychologically, Marcus has fallen into the trap of quote 30 __. When a gift or assistance significantly exceeds a person's current capacity for repayment, they begin to feel psychological discomfort that can only be soothed through total submission. Eleonora applied the invalidation of personal boundaries through forced gratitude. She uses the neurochemistry of guilt. Every time Marcus tries to manifest independence, his brain activates centers associated with social disapproval. Eleonora fixed a pattern in his consciousness. Quote 31 physiologically. Marcus exhibits an increased level of cortisol against a background of suppressed testosterone. He is in the position of a quote 32 whose resources, time and energy, are now assets of the dominant individual. 3. Phase quote 33. This mechanism was brilliantly described by the sociologist Marcel Mauss in his study quote 34 quote. In archaic societies, there existed a custom called quote 35 quote, a competition in giving. He who gave more literally destroyed the status of his opponent, turning him into his slave or subordinate, if the latter could not respond with an equivalent gift. In modern psychology, this is confirmed by the experiments of Dennis Regan, 1971. Subjects to whom an assistant bought a bottle of quote 36 for no reason subsequently bought lottery tickets from him twice as often, and for amounts many times exceeding the cost of the drink. The sense of debt is an ancient biological mechanism for the survival of the species, which predators use for enslavement. Eleonora conducted a quote 37 on the scale of one family, buying the right to dispose of Marcus's life. 4. Phase counterstrike. Marcus needed to separate financial debt from personal obligations. The gratitude trap works only as long as you recognize its moral legitimacy. Lesson number 2. Radical sovereignty. Never allow money to be converted into obedience. If assistance was rendered to you for which you cannot pay with money right now, establish a clear repayment schedule or immediately define the boundaries. Marcus's counterstrike should have sounded like this: I infinitely value your help and will return the money as soon as I can. However, my work schedule for the weekend remains the same, as it is exactly what will allow me to close this debt. Remember, he who gets angry at your refusal to obey after his gift was never kind to you. He was simply buying your will. 5. Phase sensory immersion. The living room smelled of lilies, a heavy, sweetish aroma that in large doses causes a headache. Eleonora sat in a beam of cold evening light, and her diamond ring cast sharp glints onto Marcus's face like small laser sights. The creak of his leather shoes on the parquet seemed unnaturally loud, emphasizing his desire to escape from this flawless space, where every piece of furniture served as a reminder of how much he now owed for the right to be there. Chapter 3. Information vacuum and the erasing of value. A professional environment is not a place for the realization of your talents. It is a battlefield for the distribution of resources, where your self-esteem is the primary hostage. The most sophisticated method of subordination is not the deprivation of money, but the deprivation of confidence that you deserve it. If you allow another person to determine the value of your time and efforts, you voluntarily hand over the keys to your reality. We proceed to the dissection of the mechanisms of professional gaslighting, where numbers become an instrument of psychological dismantling. 1. Phase. Collision. Julian sat at a massive table of polished steel, which reflected the light of the ceiling lamps like a scalpel blade. Sarah stood opposite him. She was a leading analyst, and it was precisely her strategies that had brought the company a profit of 32% over the last quarter. According to her contract, she was entitled to a bonus of $150,000. Sit down, Sarah. Julian did not lift his eyes from the tablet screen. He forced her to stand for exactly 45 seconds, a time sufficient for her brain to begin generating slight anxiety. I have come to discuss the quarterly results and the bonus portion. Sarah's voice sounded firm, but Julian noticed how her thumb barely touched her wedding ring. A reaction to stress, a search for support. Bonus? Julian slowly raised his gaze. His face expressed sincere, almost painful bewilderment. Sarah, I value your enthusiasm, but we both know that the current indicators are the result of market inertia and the work of the sales department. Your reports were... He made a long, heavy pause of 10 seconds. Satisfactory, but nothing more. Sarah felt the ground slip from under her feet. In her bag lay a report confirming her personal contribution, but Julian's cold confidence began to eat through her memory like acid. But we discussed this in January, you said, she began. I said that we would consider the possibility if the results were exceptional. Julian interrupted her, lowering his voice by half a tone. This was a technique of dominance through the imitation of parental severity. Unfortunately, right now the company is forced to optimize expenses. I have authorized a bonus of $5,000 for your efforts. That is more than the others received. Julian saw Sarah's face turn pale. He deliberately offered an insultingly small sum to make her feel like an incompetent beggar rather than a partner. Take this money, Sarah, and in the next quarter, try to prove that you are truly worth more. You are dismissed. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. In this scene, Julian applies financial gaslighting in combination with an informational vacuum. He purposefully erases Sarah's objective achievements, replacing them with his subjective interpretation. The key mechanism here is cognitive dissonance. Sarah's brain collides with two contradictory facts. I worked effectively, and my authoritative supervisor says that I am mediocre. Under conditions of hierarchical pressure, the brain often chooses the version of the dominant to avoid social conflict. Physiologically, Sarah is experiencing a powerful release of cortisol. With chronic exposure to such pressure, suppression of the hippocampus occurs, leading to a deterioration of memory and the ability to think logically. Julian is literally physically destroying her ability to resist. The use of the pause and the steel table creates an environment in which Sarah feels biologically unprotected. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. This tactic is based on the phenomenon of learned helplessness, discovered by Martin Seligman in 1967. In his experiment, dogs that received electric shocks and had no possibility of stopping them eventually stopped even trying to escape when such an opportunity appeared. They simply lay down and whimpered. Julian is doing the same to Sarah. By devaluing her success and violating financial promises, He accustoms her to the idea that her efforts do not affect the result. She becomes a psychological slave who will work even harder, trying to earn approval that will never be given to her. This is the highest form of exploitation, forcing the victim to believe that her low price is her own fault. 4. Phase. Counterstrike. Sarah made a mistake by entering into a dialogue without an external anchor. In the world of predators, verbal agreements are worth less than the paper they are not written on. Lesson number 3. Fixation of reality. Never enter a predator's office without a protocol of achievements confirmed by third parties or independent data. The counterstrike should be technical. Julian, according to the figures in the system, my contribution amounted to 32% of the profit. Is $5,000 a calculation error or an official notification of a revision of the terms of my contract? I need to know this for consultation with my lawyer before signing the report. Remember, a predator retreats when they realize that the victim has maintained a connection with reality and is ready to move the conflict into the legal or public field. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. The office smelled of freshly ground coffee and ozone from the numerous servers, scents of success that now seemed to Sarah like the scent of a morgue. The hum of the ventilation pressed on her ears, creating a sensation that the walls of the office were slowly closing in. The reflection of her own frightened face in the steel surface of Julian's table was distorted and gray. In this sterile cleanliness, there was no room for human emotions, only dry calculation and the quiet rustle of the printer printing the verdict on her ambitions. Chapter 4. The Trap of Reflected Light. You believe that your purchases are the result of your free choice and aesthetic taste. This is yet another lie that you feed to your ego so as not to recognize yourself as a victim of social engineering. Your consumption is a cry for help from neurons craving confirmation of status in a hierarchy that you do not control. You do not buy things. You buy the right not to feel like a non-entity in the eyes of those who do not care about you. We proceed to the dissection of the mechanisms that force you to voluntarily surrender your resources for the illusion of belonging to the higher circle. 1. Phase. Collision. Julian stood at the window of a private club, sipping whiskey, the cost of which equaled the monthly budget of a small family. Opposite him, Marcus tried to appear as one of his own, adjusting the cuffs of a new shirt that cost $800. Marcus felt the stiff fabric chafing his skin, but for him, it was a sensation of success. His brain recorded not the discomfort, but the symbolic meaning of the brand. Good watch, Marcus. Julian threw out carelessly, without even glancing at his interlocutor's wrist. He knew that this phrase would force Marcus to immediately reveal his insecurity. Thank you. It is a limited edition, Marcus answered, trying to make his voice sound casual. Inside, he was exultant. He noticed, that means I have passed the filter. It cost me $45,000 at auction. Julian slowly turned around. His gaze was heavy like lead. $45,000 for a tool that shows time no more accurately than the screen of your phone? Julian barely raised an eyebrow. Did you buy it because you like it, or because you hoped that I would see your potential in it? Marcus froze. A sip of his drink got stuck in his throat. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. His internal monologue turned into a chaotic search for excuses. Why did I say that? He thinks I am an upstart. I should have kept silent or named a sum twice as large. It is an investment, Marcus managed to say. No, Marcus. An investment is something that brings income. And this is a tax on your need for approval, which you pay to Swiss masters. Julian took a step forward, invading Marcus's intimate zone. You spent 2 months of your life working for this piece of metal, simply to sit here with me. The irony is that I do not care what is on your wrist. What matters to me is only how easily you can be manipulated through your vanity. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Here we observe conspicuous consumption as a form of social mimicry. Marcus uses an expensive signal to compensate for internal insecurity regarding his professional value. Julian applies the destruction of social support. He first gives Marcus a social stroke, the compliment on the watch, and then instantly devalues this gesture, causing an acute attack of shame in the victim. Shame is the most powerful tool of control, as it forces a person to strive to improve and please the dominant even more. Physiologically, Marcus experiences a sharp spike in adrenaline, followed by a fall in serotonin levels. His brain at this moment is in social survival mode. He perceives Julian's words as a threat of expulsion from the pack, which, for a biological being, is equivalent to death. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. This pattern of behavior is confirmed by the phenomenon of the Veblen effect, described by sociologist Thorstein Veblen in his work, The Theory of the Leisure Class. Veblen proved that demand for certain goods grows as their price increases because their primary function is to serve as a marker of high status. A more modern experiment was conducted by psychologist Leon Festinger within the framework of the social comparison theory, 1954. He established that people evaluate their value and well-being not by objective indicators, but by comparison with those around them. Marcus bought the watch not for himself, but in order to level up with Julian. Julian, understanding this mechanism, uses it to establish total superiority. He shows Marcus that his ticket to high society is merely a cheap fake in the eyes of those who truly possess power. 4. Phase. Counter-strike. Marcus fell into the classic arms race trap, where the winner is always the manufacturer of luxury items, not the buyer. Lesson number 4. The zero signal strategy. True power does not need demonstration. The more you spend on symbols of status, the more vulnerable you become to the manipulations of those who manage these symbols. Marcus's counterstrike should have consisted of a total ignoring of the evaluation. For me, it is just a watch, Julian. I bought it because I can afford it without thinking about its cost. Let us proceed to the business that is truly worth your time and mine. Remember, a predator loses interest when they realize that you are not seeking their approval. He who has nothing to prove is invulnerable to shame. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. In the club, it smelled of old oak and expensive tobacco, the aroma of which ate into one's clothes like the smell of decay. The light was dimmed, turning the faces of those present into frozen masks of wax. The creak of Marcus's expensive shoes on the carpet seemed deafening to him, as if every step betrayed his status as an imposter. The cold glass of whiskey in his hand became covered with small drops of condensation that flowed down his fingers, resembling the cold sweat of fear he so desperately tried to hide under a layer of branded things. Chapter 5. Radical Pragmatism and the Hygiene of Compassion. Pity is a mental parasite that sucks out your energy and clouds your vision. In the world of capital, sympathy for a loser is not a virtue, but a biological failure. When your competitor or partner is drowning, your task is not to lend him a hand, but to evaluate the value of his assets before they sink to the bottom. Radical pragmatism requires a cold dissection of reality. Another person's crisis is your most profitable entry point. If you feel guilt for extracting profit from another person's collapse, it means you are still in the lower part of the food chain. Today, we will learn to see in tragedy the mathematics of dominance. 1. Phase. Underscore. Quote underscore 91 underscore Marcus's office looked like a crime scene. Everywhere lay printouts of financial reports. Monitors glowed with the alarming red color of stock market graphs, and a heavy smell of cheap coffee and stale sweat hung in the air. Marcus sat, clutching his head in his hands. His startup, into which he had invested 5 years of his life, had just been declared insolvent. Julian entered without knocking. His 3-piece suit in the color of the quote underscore 92 underscore seemed provocatively ideal in this chaos. He slowly walked to the window, pushing aside an empty pizza box with his foot. Julian said, without turning around. He deliberately used a low, vibrating timbre that subconsciously is associated with authority and calmness. Quote underscore 94 underscore Marcus raised his reddened eyes. His pupils were constricted, and his skin had acquired a grayish tint, a sign of prolonged exposure to cortisol and a deficit of sleep. Quote underscore 95 underscore. In his voice, a plea was heard. He was subconsciously seeking a quote 96 figure. Quote 97. Julian turned and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Quote 98. Marcus shuddered. The sum was 10 times less than the market value. Quote 99, he whispered. His brain tried to cling to the remnants of pride, but the survival instinct was already dictating capitulation. Julian cut him off. He maintained a pause of 8 seconds, looking Marcus straight in the bridge of his nose. Julian did not move. He stood motionless like a rock, watching as Marcus slowly reached for the pen. Julian knew, when a person is in a state of acute crisis, their ability for long-term planning shuts down. Only the fear of immediate pain remains. 2. Phase. Quote underscore 102 underscore. In this scene, Julian demonstrates predatory opportunistic behavior. He utilizes quote underscore 103 underscore based on fear. By naming the sum of 500,000 as the only path to salvation from prison, he narrows Marcus's planning horizon to a single point. The mechanism of quote underscore 104 underscore is working here. Julian is not simply buying patents. He is buying them at the moment of the seller's maximum psychological vulnerability. From the perspective of ethology, this is the behavior of a dominant who takes resources from a weakened individual to strengthen the pack's positions or his own. Physiologically, Marcus is in a state of cognitive paralysis. His prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational analysis, is suppressed by the activity of the amygdala. In such a state, a person is ready to give gold for a sip of water. Julian is the one who controls access to the water. 3. Phase underscore. Quote underscore 105 underscore. This tactic echoes the quote underscore 106 underscore conducted by Muzaffar Sherif in 1954. The experiment showed that in conditions of artificially created resource scarcity, 2 groups of teenagers instantly transitioned from neutrality to open hostility and attempts to destroy the competitor. But most important here is how the group leaders utilized the quote underscore 107 underscore crises to lure participants away or seize their quote 108. In the psychology of power, this is called the quote 109. When resources are scarce Or when one side loses control, the other side is obliged to occupy the power vacuum. Julian is not quote one, 10 __. He is simply following a biological law. If a resource is not seized by an efficient owner, it will be destroyed. His lack of empathy is a strategic tool allowing him to make decisions that Marcus is unable to make due to his emotions. 4. Phase quote 111 Marcus lost long before Julian's arrival because he allowed his emotions and quote 112 to blind him. Lesson number 5. Amor fati, love of fate, and the will to power. In a moment of crisis, you must cut off everything superfluous. If your ship is going to the bottom, do not try to save the furniture. Save the engine. Marcus's counterstrike, had he been prepared, would have consisted of a preemptive search for several quote 113 and pitting them against each other so that the price would not fall to 500,000. Remember, self-pity is poison. The only way to survive a crisis is to become an even greater pragmatist than the one who came for your assets. Accept the inevitable, amor fati, and use it as a foundation for the next leap. 5. Phase quote 114. The office smelled of cold ash and ozone from overheated computers. Outside the window, rain was beginning, and the drops broke against the glass with a quiet tap, like the fingers of creditors demanding their own. Julian felt the cold of the metal of his pen in his pocket, a cold that calmed him. The light of the lamps flickered, creating jagged shadows on Marcus's pale face. In this silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the loser, Julian felt the taste of power, a dry, metallic, almost intoxicating taste of victory over another's weakness. Chapter 6. Sexuality as currency and the capital of attachment emotions are the interface through which a predator hacks your security system. If you believe that intimacy lies outside the zone of capital's influence, you are an ideal target. In the higher echelons of the social hierarchy, sex and attachment are not manifestations of feelings, but a form of silent lending. He who manages your dopamine manages your signatures on contracts. We proceed to the dissection of the oldest and most effective method of control, the conversion of intimacy into an instrument of financial expansion. 1. Phase collision. The penthouse terrace was flooded with cold moonlight, which turned the pool into a mirror of black obsidian. Eleonora sat on the edge of a sun lounger, her silk dress in the color of ash rose, rustling barely perceptibly with every breath. Marcus stood opposite her. After 5 hours of exhausting negotiations with investors, he looked broken, and Eleonora knew that right now his defense was at its lowest level in all 24 hours. You take too much upon yourself, Marcus. Her voice was soft like velvet concealing steel. She stood up and slowly approached him, reducing the distance to 10 centimeters. She deliberately invaded his intimate zone, forcing his brain to switch from analyzing figures to analyzing her physical presence. She placed her palm on his chest, directly over his heart. Marcus felt the warmth of her skin, and his breathing faltered. Your partners do not value you as I do, she whispered, looking him straight in the eyes. She used the technique of emotional stroking, creating a contrast between the cruel world of business and a safe harbor in her person. Why do you need to fight for those 10% shares if we can merge our assets? I will cover your rear, and you will finally be able to relax. Marcus closed his eyes for 3 seconds. At that moment, His prefrontal cortex was struggling with a powerful release of oxytocin. The desire for protection and proximity began to dominate over strategic calculation. This will change the ownership structure, Eleonora. I will become dependent, he managed to say, although his hand already involuntarily lay on her waist. You will become part of something greater. She smiled. And in that smile, there was no warmth, only the cold calculation of a player who has just delivered a checkmate. She knew that tomorrow morning, against the background of the hormonal drop and the feeling of guilt or gratitude, he would sign the merger agreement on her terms. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Eleonora applies the tactic of sexual anchoring. She links physical pleasure and emotional relief to a specific business decision. In psychology, this is called conditional reinforcement. The brain's reward system is involved here. When Marcus feels Eleonora's proximity, his brain produces dopamine and oxytocin. Oxytocin lowers the level of critical thinking and increases trust in the object of attachment. Eleonora acts in the role of a dealer of these neurotransmitters. She offers a dose of calmness and acceptance in exchange for real assets. This is a form of soft gaslighting. She convinces him that his struggle for independence is merely fatigue and a mistake, and that surrendering his positions is wisdom and self-care. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. This mechanism illustrates the famous experiment of Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron, 1974, known as the suspension bridge experiment. Researchers discovered the phenomenon of misattribution of arousal. Men who crossed a dangerous swaying bridge, a state of stress, were far more likely to attribute their increased heart rate to sexual attraction toward the woman assistant they met at the other end than those who walked across a stable bridge. Marcus is in a state of chronic stress from business, the shaky bridge. Eleonora meets him at the end of this path and offers proximity. His brain mistakenly interprets the relief from the end of the workday and physical attraction as a sign that her offer to merge assets is a correct and safe decision. She literally privatizes his survival instinct. 4. Phase. Counter-strike. Marcus should have realized that sexual attraction and strategic partnership are two parallel lines that should not intersect at the point of decision-making. Lesson number 6. Sterilization of the contract. Never discuss the terms of deals in the bedroom or after consuming alcohol. If a partner begins to link your feelings with your resources, it is not love, it is absorption. Marcus's counter-strike should have sounded like this. I like your support as a woman, Eleonora. That is exactly why I want to keep our affairs separate, so that our feelings are never clouded by questions of property. Let us return to the figures in the office on Monday at 9 in the morning. Remember, he who tries to buy your signature for a kiss believes that your signature is worth no more than that kiss. 5. Phase. Sensory immersion. In the air of the terrace, the smells of expensive chlorine from the pool and night jasmine mixed, an aroma that seemed suffocating in its sweetness. The cold metal of the railings burned Marcus's palm, reminding him of reality, while the warmth of Eleonora's body promised oblivion. The silence of the night was broken only by the distant wail of a siren below in the city, where thousands of such Marcuses were right then exchanging their freedom for an illusion of love under the flicker of neon signs. Chapter 7. The Art of Scorched Earth. A beautiful breakup is a myth invented by those who want to reserve the right to your next resource. In the world of rigid strategies, the finale is not the credits in a movie, but the moment of the final fixation of profits and losses. If you leave having saved face, but having lost assets, you did not leave. You were shown the door, having first been fleeced. A true master of the game knows. The exit must be just as surgically precise as the entry. Your task is not to leave behind emotional hooks that a predator can use for a remission of control. Today, we dissect the mechanics of the break and the strategy of scorched earth. 1. Phase. Collision. Julian sat at a table on which there was nothing except for one sealed envelope. Marcus entered, trying to maintain his dignity, though his shoulders were tense as if he expected a physical blow. He had come to announce his exit from the partnership, naively believing that the merits accumulated over 3 years were sufficient for a peaceful divorce. I have prepared the documents, Julian. I am taking my share of 25%, Dad, and going into independent navigation. Marcus placed the folder on the table. His voice faltered on the last word, a subconscious insecurity in his own right to freedom. Julian did not even look at the folder. He slowly took the envelope and pushed it toward Marcus. In this envelope, Marcus, Julian said with the intonation of a pathologist, is a report on your personal expenses at the company's expense over the last 2 years. Also, there are printouts of your correspondence with competitors during that period when you believed I was not looking. Marcus felt nausea rising to his throat. His plan for a beautiful exit crumbled into dust. It was a misunderstanding. I will compensate for everything. Undoubtedly, Julian slightly tilted his head. You will compensate for it with your refusal of your share. You will sign the transfer of rights for $1. Julian observed Marcus's micro-expressions, dilated nostrils, white knuckles. This was the phase of the total collapse of reality. You cannot do this. Marcus faltered, searching for a word that would not sound pathetic. We were instruments for each other, Marcus. Julian stood up, fastening one button of his jacket. You have become an ineffective instrument, and ineffective instruments are thrown away. If you sign now, you will keep your reputation. If not, tomorrow this report will be on the prosecutor's desk. You have 3 minutes. 2. Phase. Psychological X-ray. Julian applies the strategy of total devaluation of the past. He destroys the endowment effect, in which Marcus overvalues the significance of his share simply because it belongs to him. The key mechanism here is the exploitation of the fear of loss. For Marcus's brain, the threat of prison and disgrace is much weightier than the potential profit from owning a share in the company. Julian uses informational blackmail not for the sake of money, but for the sake of the total dismantling of the partner's agency. Physiologically, Marcus is in a state of semantic collapse. His values, friendship, common years of work, were used against him. At this moment, a sharp release of norepinephrine occurs, paralyzing the ability to negotiate. Julian dominates through the demonstration of absolute readiness to destroy everything if his conditions are not accepted. 3. Phase. Psychological precedent. This situation is a vivid illustration of Martin Schubich's dollar auction. In this psychological experiment, people begin to bid for $1. The rule is simple. The dollar goes to the one who bid the most, but the money is paid to the organizer by the person who took second place as well. As a result, people, fearing to lose the 10 or 20 cents already bid, begin to pay $5, $10, and even $100 for $1. They fall into the sunk cost trap. Marcus invested years in loyalty to Julian, and now Julian forces him to pay even more, the entire share, simply not to lose the little that remains: freedom. Julian is the auction organizer who knows that Marcus cannot afford to lose, even if the price of victory is total ruin. 4. Phase. Counter-strike. Marcus's mistake was in his sentimentality. He believed that a fair partnership creates insurance against aggression. Lesson number 7. Deconstruction of the finale. Begin to plan your exit on the same day you sign the contract to enter. Guard your emergency suitcase of compromising material on your partner just as carefully as he guards his on you. Marcus's counterstrike should have been prepared in advance. Julian, before you open that report, check your mail. There is a copy of documents about your offshore accounts, which will automatically be sent to the tax authorities if I do not enter a confirmation code every 12 hours. Let us discuss a fair price for my share. Remember, in a relationship with a predator, peace is possible only on terms of mutually assured destruction. 5. Phase: sensory immersion. In the office, it smelled of ozone and old paper, a dry, lifeless smell of bureaucratic execution. The clock on the wall counted the seconds with a heavy, metallic clang that echoed in Marcus's temples. The light of the lamps was reflected in the polished surface of the table, creating the illusion of a bottomless black pit between him and Julian. When Marcus took the pen, its plastic body seemed unbearably heavy to him, as if he were lifting a fragment of his own gravestone. The silence was so absolute that even the rustle of the paper under the nib was audible. The sound of how one person's life finally passes into the property of another. We have completed the autopsy. Before you lie fragments of social reality, cleansed of the husk of ethics and cultural superstructures. Money is not what lies in your wallet. It is what allows you to define the boundaries of another's freedom and to protect your own. If this investigation forced you to feel discomfort, it means your protective mechanisms are still alive. If it caused you a cold excitement, it means you are ready to take your place in the hierarchy, not as a resource, but as a strategist. Now you see the shadows that capital casts. You understand that behind every zero in a bank statement stands someone's will, someone's weakness, and someone's defeated nature. Accept this world as it is. Cold, calculating, and infinitely beautiful in its biological precision. This is amor fati, love of the fate that you no longer fear, because you have learned to manage it. And remember, in this game, there are no final winners. There are only those who still hold their hand on the pulse of events. Intellectual aggression is your armor. Radical pragmatism is your sword. Go and take what belongs to you by the right of strength and reason. Knowledge of the mechanisms of the psyche is your primary freedom. Subscribe so that together we may explore the hidden facets of human behavior. And be sure to write in the comments which psychological pattern or strategy we shall dissect next time. Let us seek the truth together.